More than 2 decades later, we're still talking about The Lord of the Rings as something that quietly shaped how we experience fantasy on screen. What Peter Jackson created wasn't simply an adaptation. It was a world that felt real, lived in, and unforgettable. Of course, the foundation was already magnificent. J.R.R. Tolkien gave us a story of depth, myth, and meaning, but somehow the films made that world even more lovable, more immediate, and far more widely embraced than ever before. And at the heart of it stood one performance that continues to rise above an even extraordinary cast: Sir Ian McKellen. Among legends, he became the one we remember the most, because Gandalf could have been just another wise wizard, powerful, distant, untouchable, but McKellen made him something else entirely: warm, human, and deeply real. He didn't just play Gandalf, he defined him. So the question is, why him? Why was Ian McKellen the perfect choice? And what exactly did he bring that made Gandalf one of the most memorable characters in film history? Especially when someone like Sir Christopher Lee was present in the project. Such a legend in his own right. Why wasn't he Gandalf? Hey everyone, now, if you've been walking these roads with me for a while, you'll know that I usually speak to you not as a critic or a scholar, but a humble hobbit, a descendant of Samwise Gamgee, sharing tales, memories, and quiet thoughts of Middle-earth. That, of course, still going to be the main playlist of this channel though, but today we're stepping a little off that usual path. We're not going into another corner of the Shire, but into the world of cinema itself. I won't pretend to be a great wizard of the screen nor a learned lore master of the craft, but I am a viewer, someone who has watched these films, felt them, and wondered about the choices behind them. So for this one, please stay with me as we look at these masterpieces after more than 20 years as something shaped by a kind of magic that still lingers with us all these years later, because these films still feel as powerful, as comforting, and as unforgettable as the first time we watched them. So to begin with, we are not simply looking at a casting choice, we are looking at a meeting of two legends. Sir Ian McKellen, the Gandalf we came to know, to trust, and to remember. An actor of extraordinary range, whose craft was shaped not only by film but by decades upon decades on the stage. Widely regarded as one of the great performers of his generation, McKellen built his reputation through Shakespearean role, where language, emotion, and presence must all work in perfect harmony. There is a precision to his delivery, but never at the cost of warmth. A control in his performance, yet always room for humanity to breathe. McKellen's strength lies in his ability to feel accessible, to invite the audience in rather than stand apart from them. By the time he stepped into Middle-earth, he brought with him not just experience but a rare balance of intellect, sensitivity, and emotional depth, qualities that would allow him to shape Gandalf into something far more than a figure of power, into something profoundly real. On the other side, Sir Christopher Lee, a towering figure of cinema and music who instead took the role of Saruman. The man is a true giant of cinema. Lee's career spanned decades, marked by an unmistakable voice, a commanding presence, and a gravitas that few actors have ever possessed. From his iconic performances in classic horror films to his later roles in epic sagas, he carried with him an air of authority that seemed almost timeless. But beyond his filmography, what makes him especially remarkable in this context is his deep personal connection to Tolkien's world. Having met Tolkien himself and read all his books numerous times, he wasn't wasn't just an actor stepping into Middle-earth, he was someone who had long lived within it, understood its rhythms and respected its depth. In many ways, he was not only qualified for the role, he was uniquely tied to it. So two extraordinary actors, both more than capable, both deeply connected to the world of Tolkien, and yet only one became Gandalf. So the question is not simply who is better, but rather who was right for this role in this story at this time. To explore that, we're going to walk through this step by step, looking at 5 key aspects that shaped this decision. First, acting style, the difference between warmth and authority. Then, what Peter Jackson, the filmmaker, actually needed for the story. After that, Tolkien accuracy and energy, telling you how each actor aligned with the spirit of the original work. Then, screen chemistry and character dynamics, telling you how Gandalf connects with the world around him. And finally, range within a single character, because Gandalf is not just one version of himself. And by the end of this journey, we may begin to see why this choice between two giants shaped the way we experience the Lord of the Rings to this very day. Let us begin with something subtle, yet absolutely decisive, the feeling each of these actors bring the moment they stepped on a screen. Ian McKellen approaches Gandalf not as a distant legend, but as someone you could sit beside by the fire. There is gentleness in his voice, a quiet humor in his timing, and a kind of emotional openness that draws you in. He listens, he reassures, he smiles, and when needed, he grieves. His Gandalf feels like a mentor, but also like a friend, even a grandfatherly presence, someone the fellowship and we as the viewers can trust without hesitation. Now, Christopher Lee brings something equally powerful but very different. His presence is commanding, almost regal. There is a natural authority in the way he speaks and carries himself, measured, precise, and unwavering. It's the kind of presence that demands attention but not necessarily closeness. And that difference matters more than it might seem, because Gandalf is not simply a figure of power, he is a guide. He must stand beside hobbits, not above them. He must feel reachable, not remote. The audience, much like Frodo Baggins, needs to feel safe in his presence, not small before it. And this is where McKellen finds that delicate balance. He carries immense power but wears it lightly. You never doubt his strength, yet you are never afraid of it. Lee, for all his brilliance, naturally leans toward presence over intimacy. And in a story where hope travels hand in hand with vulnerability, Gandalf needed to feel like someone you could follow, not someone you could simply obey. Now, beyond acting style, there is the question every director must answer. What does the story demand from this character moment to moment? Gandalf is not written as a constant. He is not always the same presence in every scene. At times, he is quiet, almost reflective, offering guidance in soft, measured words. At other times, he becomes something far greater, a force that can confront darkness head-on, as in that unforgettable "you shall not pass" moment. So, the role required a rare kind of balance. The ability to deliver quiet wisdom without losing attention, the capacity to shift suddenly into overwhelming power, and most importantly, to remain human and relatable through it all. This is where Sir Ian McKellen proved uniquely suited. His deep roots in classical theater, especially Shakespeare, trained him in exactly this kind of range. On stage, an actor must command silence as effectively as they command intensity. They must move between stillness and eruption without breaking the illusion of the character. And McKellen brings that discipline into every scene. He can lower his voice and make you lean in. Then, in the next breath, fill the space with authority and fire without ever feeling like a different person. It's not a switch, it's a continuum. That consistency is crucial because Gandalf is not just powerful in bursts, he is believable in every state he inhabits. And from a filmmaking perspective, that kind of control is not just impressive, it's essential. Now here is where things take an interesting turn, because if we were to judge purely on connection to the source material, Christopher Lee would seem like the obvious choice. He was, after all, the only member of the cast who had actually met J.R.R. Tolkien himself in person. He had read the books countless times, understood the world intimately, and even expressed a deep desire to play Gandalf. In terms of knowledge and reverence, few could rival him, and yet Tolkien's world is not only about accuracy, it's about his spirit, because Gandalf is a very particular kind of being. He is wise, yes, but never rigid, powerful, but rarely imposing. There is something almost playful in him at times, a lightness that coexists with his gravity. He can speak of great matters one moment and share a quiet laugh the next. This is where Sir Ian McKellen aligns more naturally with the energy of the character. His performance carries a softness, a subtle whimsy, something that feels closer to the wandering wizard described in the books, not diminished in power, but deliberately unassuming. By contrast, Lee's voice, tone, and presence carry a sharper edge, precise, controlled, and intellectually dominant. Qualities that are in truth perfectly suited to Saruman, the wizard who has moved away from warmth into cold certainty. So while Lee may have held a deeper personal connection to Tolkien's world, McKellen embodied the feeling to Gandalf within it. And in a story like this, that distinction makes all the difference. Now let us look not at Gandalf alone, but at how he lives within the world around him. Because a character like Gandalf does not exist in isolation. He is constantly interacting, guiding, comforting, challenging, especially with the hobbits, such as Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee, aka my grandfather. These relationships are not secondary, they are essential. Within Ian McKellen, there is an immediate sense of ease in these interactions. He lowers himself into their world, both physically and emotionally. There is a lightness in his exchanges, a quiet humor, and most importantly, a sense of genuine care. You believe that the hobbits trust him because you trust him. He creates a playful warmth that softens even the heaviest moment, an emotional bond that feels earned, not imposed, and a sense of safety that carries through the entire journey. This chemistry becomes the emotional foundation of the story. Now imagine the same dynamics with Christopher Lee. Lee's presence, while powerful, naturally creates distance. His tone suggests authority rather than companionship. He feels like someone to be respected, perhaps even feared, but not easily approached. And that very quality is exactly what makes him so effective as Saruman. As a fallen mentor, he is meant to feel removed, someone who once guided others but now stands above them, separated by pride and certainty. His interactions are not built on warmth but on control. So in terms of on-screen relationships, the distinction becomes clear. Gandalf must walk beside the characters, Saruman stands above them, and McKellen, more than anyone, makes that difference feel natural and real. Finally, we come to something that is easy to overlook, yet incredibly difficult to achieve. The ability to let a character change without ever feeling like a different person. Gandalf is not static. Over the course of the story, he undergoes a transformation that is not just visual or symbolic, but deeply internal. Ian McKellen gives us Gandalf the Grey, a wandering wizard, humble in presence, patient, grounded, someone who moves quietly through the world, guiding rather than commanding. And we have Gandalf the White, a being of heightened presence, carrying a sense of authority that feels almost otherworldly, much brighter, sharper, and undeniably much more powerful. There is so much contrast, but what makes this work is not just contrast alone, it is the continuity between these two. McKellen does not simply switch from one version to another, instead he allows the change to feel like a natural unfolding, as if the same soul has stepped forward, more revealed than before. The warmth is still there, but now tempered with clarity. The humanity remains, but now carries weight. This kind of transformation requires more than projecting strength. It demands control, restraint, and a deep understanding of the character's core. Because such role, if handled poorly, Gandalf the White could feel distant, even unrecognizable. But McKellen ensures that even at his most powerful, Gandalf never loses the essence that made us trust him in the beginning. And that is what makes the journey believable. Not just he becomes greater, but that he remains himself all along. And so it was never a question of whether Christopher Lee could have been Gandalf, because he absolutely could. In another telling, in other tone, he might have given us a very different wizard, one shaped by grandeur, authority, and a commanding presence that few could match, but that was never the direction these films were aiming for. Because in the world that Peter Jackson brought to life, Gandalf was not just a character, he was a function, the emotional anchor of the story, the one presence that steadies both the Fellowship and us as viewers. He was never meant to stand above others as a distant figure of power. He was meant to walk among them, to guide, to comfort, to carry light into places where hope felt fragile. Because we do not simply watch Middle-earth, we experience it through eyes like Frodo Baggins, and Gandalf is the hand that leads us through it. If that hand feels distant, we feel lost. If it feels warm, we feel at home. And that is where Ian McKellen became something more than just a casting choice. He became the heart of Gandalf. Where Lee embodies power, authority, and a quiet menace, McKellen brings heart, wisdom, and the warmth that lingers along even after the scene has passed. And more than that, he creates contrast, a Gandalf who feels human is standing against a Saruman who has become something colder, light beside intellect, compassion beside control. Without that contrast, something vital in the story would quietly fade, even in the smallest detail, in a glance, a softened voice, a moment of humor. McKellen reminds us that Gandalf's power is not in dominance, but in restraint. Not that he lacks strength, but that he chooses gentleness. And in doing so, he shapes where we stand as an audience, not beneath him as subjects, but beside him as companions on the road. Because in the end, this was never just about performance, it was about the emotional architecture of the story itself. One presence to steady us and one to unsettle the world. And in a story where the smallest hands can change the fate of the world, strength alone is not enough. The world did not need a Gandalf who overwhelmed us like a storm of lightning, dazzling, untouchable, and distant. It needed a Gandalf where we would follow. A Gandalf who feels like hope in its truest form. And that is why, even after all these years, when we think of Gandalf, we see McKellen. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing and joining me for what comes next.